Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets, and if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you so much for spending your time with me tonight. Before we get into it, here is tonight's question. If you discovered that one of history's most powerful civilizations had kept meticulous records of the people it enslaved, filed them in organized rooms with proper shelving, and then sealed those rooms with legal documents designed to prevent anyone from ever speaking those names above ground, would you open the seal? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's get into it. They do not tell you, in the academic literature, what limestone smells like when it has been sealed for 3,000 years. The textbooks describe the stratigraphy, the pottery sequences, the carbon dating margins of error, the typological parallels between one ceramic assemblage and another. They do not describe the smell. I will describe it for you because I have come to understand that it is important, that it is in fact the beginning of the story, in a way that no formal report would allow me to state. It smells like old teeth, like the inside of a mouth that has not opened since before the concept of a written alphabet existed in most of the world. It smells like something that was alive, exhaled once, and was never given the opportunity to finish breathing out. That is the smell that met me on the morning of the 14th of March, 1997, when the survey crew broke the secondary seal on Administrative Shaft 7 at the site we were calling. In our internal field notes, Sector Kha, approximately 4 kilometers southwest of the Giza Plateau, that smell is where this account must begin, because I have come to believe, in the years since, that everything that followed was already present inside. It curled up, and patient and waiting, the way heat waits inside a stone that has spent 1,000 years in the sun. My name is Dr. Amara Solis. I hold a doctorate in Semitic epigraphy from the University of Bologna and a secondary qualification in late Bronze Age administrative systems from the Oriental Institute in Chicago. I was 38 years old in March of 1997. I had spent the previous 11 years working excavation sites across the Levant, the Sinai Peninsula, and the eastern delta region of Egypt, with shorter seasons in Jordan and Cyprus. I was not new to sealed chambers. I was not new to the particular quality of silence that descends over a site the moment you understand that what you are standing inside has not been disturbed since the reign of a pharaoh whose name you can only approximate because the vowels of ancient Egyptian were never written down. I was, by any reasonable professional measure, experienced. I want to establish this clearly before I continue, because what I am about to record has been characterized by 2 anonymous peer reviewers, 1 department chair, and the legal representative of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities as the product of heat exhaustion, professional stress, and what one of those reviewers called an overactive literary imagination. I want the record to show that I am not a person given to overactive literary imagination. I am a person given to the precise translation of administrative, hieratic, and proto-alphabetic script. I deal in facts. What follows are the facts, entered into this account without embellishment or revision, in exactly the order in which they occurred. The Egyptian Antiquities Survey Project at Sector Kha had been running since the first week of January of that year. The original impetus was a ground-penetrating radar anomaly detected during a routine resurvey of the plateau's western administrative zone, an area that had been broadly documented since the 1880s, but never excavated with rigorous modern stratigraphy. The anomaly was consistent with a series of subterranean chambers at a depth of between 4 and 7 meters below the surface, arranged in a configuration the radar technician described in her preliminary notes as resembling New Kingdom administrative storage, the kind of installation used to manage the enormous logistical apparatus of state labor projects, not tombs, not temples, not the funerary architecture that draws the large grants and the documentary film crews administration, the archaeology of paperwork, the kind of project that gets funded precisely because it is considered too unglamorous to attract the wrong kind of attention and academic enough to be regarded as harmless. I was brought in specifically because the preliminary surface finds recovered from the deflation layer above the anomaly zone included fragments of hieratic script on pottery ostraca, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a memo slip, pieces of fired ceramic used by scribes for quick administrative notes that did not warrant a full papyrus, and several of those fragments used terminology that my colleague Prof. Beatriz Okonkwo, who led the excavation, thought might reference foreign labor populations in ways worth examining by a specialist. Prof. Okonkwo is the finest field archaeologist I have ever worked alongside. She has the patience of geological time itself and the organizational rigor of someone who has spent 30 years untangling the bureaucratic record of one of history's most documentation-obsessed civilizations. She does not call people in unnecessarily. When she telephoned me in the second week of February and said, in her characteristically restrained way, that she thought the epigraphy might be worth my looking at in person, I had already booked a flight before the call was finished. The site camp was modest by the standards of large-scale excavations, but entirely adequate for the work. A cluster of canvas-sided shelters with aluminum framing set on a low limestone ridge that kept the tents above the sand drift patterns that moved through the basin below each afternoon. We ran a generator for the documentation equipment, the ground-penetrating radar monitor, and the basic medical supplies. For everything else, the tents, the common area, the shaft itself, once we were inside it, we used oil lamps, the thick-wicked kind that burn a dense mineral oil and produce a warm amber light that is actually better for reading incised or scratched text than most electric alternatives because of the way it rakes across surface. Irregularities. The site camp was run, as Egyptian excavation camps have been run for as long as I have worked in the region, by a small permanent support staff, including the camp manager, a man named Tariq, who had worked archaeological sites in this region for 22 years, and who made a tea so concentrated and mineral dark that it left a visible sediment in the bottom of your cup that one of the younger crew members took to reading, half-jokingly, like a prophecy each morning. Tariq was a composed, practical, undemonstrative person who did his job with the quiet efficiency of someone who had seen everything a field site could produce and had long since sorted it all into categories. On my third day at the camp, I noticed that he never went near the mouth of Shaft 7. He would bring the morning tea to the work area, set it on the wooden table we had positioned near the shaft entrance for exactly that purpose, and withdraw to a distance of approximately 15 meters, where he would stand with his arms folded waiting for the empty cups to be returned. On the 5th day, I asked him about it, in Arabic, walking back from the shaft after the morning briefing. He looked at me with the particular expression of a person who has been asked to explain something that they consider self-evident to anyone paying the right kind of attention. He said, quietly, that some doors are closed from the inside. Then he handed me a fresh cup of his geological tea and walked back to the camp kitchen. I entered it in my field journal that night under the heading Local Color and Cultural Context. I was wrong to file it there. I should have filed it under methodology. The shaft itself was opened in progressive stages, according to standard excavation protocol. The uppermost fill was a rubble pack, tightly compacted but not architecturally sophisticated, consistent with a closure applied to a space that was anticipated to be reopened within a generation or two. A working administrative closure, not a funerary one. The crew cleared it in 3 days of careful trowel and brushwork, with full photographic documentation of each removal layer. The secondary seal, which we reached on the 12th of March, was a different order of intention entirely. It was a fitted limestone cap, cut to the interior dimensions of the shaft with a precision that required either a very careful measurement or a very skilled stonemason, or both, approximately 40 centimeters thick, its lateral edges sealed with a compound of natron and organic resin that had hardened over the intervening millennia into something with the color and approximate consistency of dark amber. Along the perimeter of the cap's upper face, inscribed in the controlled, professional hand of a trained New Kingdom scribe, ran a text. It was this text that had justified my presence on the project, And it was this text that I should have attended to, not merely as a linguistic object to be translated and filed, but as a communication from someone who understood, far better than I did at the time, exactly what they were sealing inside. The inscription was in Late New Kingdom hieratic, the cursive administrative script used by Egyptian state scribes during approximately the 13th and 12th centuries before the Common Era, a script that looks, to an untrained eye, like a kind of hasty cursive shorthand derived from hieroglyphics, which is essentially what it is. It was not a prayer. It was not a dedicatory formula or a religious hymn. It was a legal instrument. Specifically, it was a boundary declaration of a type I had seen before, in property and burial contexts, but had not previously encountered in a pure administrative setting, the ancient world's equivalent of a deed restriction, and it stated, in the formal register of Egyptian legal document language, that what lay within the sealed space was the administrative record of the labor accounts for the Western Works Division of the Royal Construction Administration during a specific administrative period, that the entire contents were placed under the protection and guardianship of the god Sokar, lord of the necropolis and keeper of the boundaries between the organized world and what lay beyond it, and that the seal was not to be broken except by the authority of the institution known as the House of Life, or its formally designated successors, because, and this is the specific phrase that I put a double box around in my transcription, the phrase I read 3 times to make certain I had the grammar right. What had been accounted for within was not to be named aloud in the world above the limestone. I brought the transcription to Prof. Okonkwo that afternoon. She read it carefully, as she reads everything, without expression, and then she said that formulaic prohibitions on the oral recitation of administrative records were not entirely without precedent in contexts where religious administrative functions overlapped, and she was correct. They are not entirely without precedent. They are, however, vanishingly rare. I had encountered one partial parallel in a New Kingdom temple storage context, and a possible second in a Ptolemaic document, and neither was as explicit or as legally structured as what was inscribed on the cap of shaft 7. We noted the phrase in the formal site record. We photographed every centimeter of the inscription under raking lamplight at 3 different angles with scale bars and directional indicators in each frame. We filed the transcription with the Supreme Council Observer. And then, on the 14th of March, with the Observer present, with a team of 8, with our documentation equipment set up, and our oil lamps trimmed and lit at the base of the shaft, we broke the seal and we went in. The chamber was approximately 12 meters in length and 6 meters wide, with a ceiling height of 2.4 meters, generous for an administrative storage space of this period. The walls were dressed limestone, tight-fitted without mortar, in the manner characteristic of New Kingdom state construction. The floor was compacted earth, beaten to near stone density, entirely level. Immediately inside the entrance, arranged with the methodical care of a civil service that took its organizational responsibilities seriously, were the records. Hundreds of clay tablets in stacked groupings, papyrus scrolls in various states of desiccation, organized on sandstone shelving units that had been cut from the chamber walls rather than added as separate furniture, and quantities of the ostraca sherds, whose surface fragments had first indicated this site's potential. Along the back wall, separated from the main archive by perhaps a meter of open floor space, stood a row of wooden boxes, sealed individually with a resin application that looked, in the lamplight, darker and less weathered than the resin on the cap above applied later, I noted, or in greater haste, or both. The air, once the initial exhalation of that compressed 3,000-year breath had moved up through the shaft and dispersed, was dry in the way that only sealed desert chambers can be dry. Not the open aridity of the plateau above, but something more deliberate, more sustained, a dryness that felt, and I wrote this exact phrasing in my field journal on the night of the 14th, maintained, as though the room were still performing a function, and the function required this specific condition to continue. I established my documentation station near the entrance folding table, camera equipment, pencils, drafting pads, the 3 reference texts I carry to every site, and a second oil lamp positioned to supplement the primary one without creating conflicting shadows. We worked methodically through the first 6 hours, the team moving through the chamber in assigned zones, with the choreographed patience that good fieldwork requires. I prioritized the ostraca because they were the most fragile, and because their content, given the surface fragments, was the most directly relevant to my specialization. The pottery sherds were organized in the Egyptian administrative fashion by subject category rather than by date, and the content was precisely what the preliminary evidence had suggested: work gang records, maintained with the bureaucratic granularity that characterizes Egyptian state administration at its most functional. Rosters of workers organized into named gangs: the vigorous gang, the enduring gang, the Western gang of the 3rd year, with daily output notations, ration allocation records, tool distribution logs, infirmary entries noting injuries and incapacitations, transfer records tracking when individuals moved between gangs or project assignments. The Egyptian state was, among its many remarkable attributes, the most thoroughly documented employer in the ancient world. From these records alone, if I had nothing else, I could reconstruct the daily caloric intake, the average tool use lifespan, and the injury rate of workers who died before writing had been invented in most of Europe. And then, approximately 2 hours into my work on the ostraca, I saw the second script. It was not a different hand. The same scribe had written both, using the same stylus, in the same sitting or close to it. It was a different writing system entirely, used, apparently, for a specific subset of the data, the names of individual workers. Interspersed through the administrative hieratic, in the space where the official records gave a worker's Egyptian administrative designation, a different script had been used. I recognized it after perhaps 40 minutes of close examination under the magnifying glass, the lamp held so near that the heat of it became uncomfortable against my knuckles. It was a consonantal, alphabetic script, not hieroglyphic, not hieratic, not cuneiform, not any of the established official scripts of the ancient Near East. It was a Proto-Sinaitic form, an early alphabetic system related to what would eventually, through several centuries of development, become Phoenician and then, in one branch of that tradition, Hebrew. And the names recorded in this script, rendered phonetically, in consonants only, without the vowel pointing that would not be introduced for centuries, were Northwest Semitic in character, unmistakably the kind of names that would appear, in later forms, in the early books of the Hebrew Bible, and in the personal name records of Canaanite and Phoenician communities throughout the first millennium before the Common Era. I sat on my folding stool for a long time, without moving, after I was certain of what I was reading. I could hear the rest of the team behind me, Prof. Okonkwo's voice, low and unhurried, directing the papyrus documentation with the particular combination of authority and patience that makes her remarkable to work for. The scrape of a conservation brush, the click and rewind of a camera shutter. All of it, the ordinary sound of professionals doing careful, meticulous, important work. In my head was a very particular and very specific silence, of the kind that descends when you hold something in your hands and understand that it changes something, not overturns, not revolutionizes, not destroys, but changes, adds to, fills in a gap in a record that had previously contained only inference and theory. What I was holding was direct, in context, datable archaeological evidence of Semitic named workers within the Egyptian state labor apparatus in a document set whose administrative language classified them not as skilled contract workers, not as specialist artisans brought in voluntarily for particular projects, but as bound laborers. The ration allocation system was unambiguous on this point. Workers in the Egyptian state system received ration grades that were legally and administratively differentiated based on their status. There was a grade for free workers, a grade for conscripted Egyptian laborers, a grade for state-owned foreign workers. The Semitic named individuals in these records, hundreds of them, across what appeared to be at minimum 3 consecutive administrative cycles, spanning perhaps 15 to 20 years, were receiving the third grade. They were not guests, they were not immigrants who had settled and taken up voluntary employment. They were, in the precise and unambiguous administrative language of the Egyptian state, property of the project. I need to be careful here, and precise, because precision is what the historical record deserves. The documents did not support, and I would not claim they support, the narrative most familiar to a Western audience, the story of a single enslaved Hebrew nation, a coherent ethnic and theological community, laboring together on the construction of the pyramids at Giza before being led out of Egypt in a dramatic and unified exodus. That narrative, as generations of archaeologists have now established, is not supported by the physical evidence. The pyramids at Giza were built more than 1,000 years before the documents in this chamber were created. The workers named in those pyramid-era records, the real ones, not the fictional ones, were Egyptian, eating Egyptian rations, living in Egyptian state-provided housing, working under Egyptian supervisors whose own names and ration records are also on file. What these administrative records at Sector Kha showed was something that the popular narrative had accidentally obscured by being so dramatic, so theologically weighted, so legible as a story, the true institution. Not one dramatic, catastrophic enslavement of one coherent nation. An ongoing, bureaucratically routine, legally codified, thoroughly administered system of bound foreign labor that powered the Egyptian state for centuries, involving people from everywhere. The Egyptian reach extended from Nubia and Libya and Canaan and Syria and the Sinai and the eastern Mediterranean coast. Workers with Egyptian names and Nubian names and Libyan names and Semitic names, all processed through the same administrative machinery, all filed in the same organizational system, all present in the ledger in exactly the same handwriting and exactly the same ration grade. What made it horrifying was not its singularity. What made it horrifying, sitting in that room at the edge of the lamplight, was its absolute normality. This was not an atrocity being concealed. This was the paperwork of an ordinary Tuesday in the administrative life of a state that considered the organized subjugation of human beings to be as routine as the allocation of copper chisels. I worked until the light in the shaft above changed color to the deep gold that indicated late afternoon, and Prof. Okonkwo called the standard daily halt at approximately 6 p.m. to allow the chamber adequate ventilation time before any evening re-entry. I gathered my documentation materials in the deliberate, unhurried way that professional habit requires, even when you are thinking about something that is not the materials. I kept my pencils. I counted my film rolls. I organized my drafted transcriptions by ostraca sequence number. I was turning toward the shaft ladder when I saw the wall inscription. I do not know whether I had failed to notice it on entry, or whether the lamp had been angled incorrectly to catch it until this moment, or whether it had been there all along waiting for me to be leaving rather than arriving before it would show itself. It was on the right-hand wall, approximately 1 meter inside the entrance, at chest height, which is to say, at the height a person's hand would naturally reach if they were kneeling or crouching against the wall. Not inscribed with the precision of a trained scribe. Scratched, quickly, with something sharp and small, by a hand that bore no resemblance to the controlled professional cursive visible throughout the rest of the chamber's contents. Scratched in the same Proto-Sinaitic alphabetic script as the personal names in the administrative records, but this was not a name, it was a word. A single word. And I stood in the failing lamplight with the wick guttering at the edge of its oil and read the word 3 times to be certain of the root, and the root was clear. It was the root for remember. Not as a noun, not as a description. In the imperative, a command, written in a script that had no official standing in this administrative system, scratched into the wall of a room that was about to be sealed forever, by someone who had understood that the sealing was coming, and who had had, perhaps, only that word left to say, and only whatever sharp implement came to hand, and only however many seconds remained before the door came down. I went up the ladder. I will not apologize for leaving quickly after that. I am a field researcher, not a person who remains alone in a sealed underground room at the end of a long working day after finding a 3,000-year-old command carved by someone who was about to be locked in. I went up the shaft and I ate dinner, and I sat with the team in the common tent, and I listened to the conversation, and I contributed to it in what I believe were approximately the right places. And then I went to my tent and I wrote my field notes for the day, and I categorized the wall inscription as epigraphic anomaly, unauthorized notation, possible laborer origin, filed under further investigation required. That night I lay on my camp cot and stared at the canvas ceiling for what my watch eventually told me was 2 hours and 40 minutes before I stopped staring at it. And the reason I could not stop was not fear. Exactly. Or not only fear, but the specific sensation of having been addressed. The word on the wall had not been left for the administrative system. It had not been left for the Egyptian state. It had been left for whoever broke the seal. It was addressed to me across 32 centuries, and it had been waiting with the patience of stone for exactly as long as it needed to wait. The following morning, we opened the wooden boxes along the back wall. Prof. Okonkwo was present for the first 3, which yielded exactly the expected content: additional tablets, additional ostraca, a set of administrative seals in poor condition, fragments of what appeared to be project planning schematics drawn in red and black ink on a stiff backing material that had partially delaminated with age. The 4th box, at the far end of the row, was different when I moved it, to position it on the conservation surface, heavier at one end, in the way a container is unbalanced, when its contents have not redistributed with time. When something solid and specific is resting at one particular point, I documented the exterior with the same systematic care I had applied to everything else in the chamber. I noted the resin seal, which was the freshest looking application in the entire room, applied quickly and without the finishing attention given to the others, as though whoever sealed this particular box had done it at a different moment from the rest, possibly in the last available minutes before the limestone cap came down. I broke the resin with the standard conservation tool. I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in linen bandaging material that had desiccated over 3 millennia into a rigid brown shell around its contents, was a single papyrus scroll, and on the outer face of the linen wrapping, in the same scratched Proto-Sinaitic script as the wall inscription and the personal names, someone had written not a single word this time, but a phrase, several words. And I read the phrase there in the lamplight with my hands completely steady, which I note because it surprised me. And the phrase said, as closely as I can render it into modern English, across the translation gap of 32 centuries, the names of those who were not counted when the count was made. In a room whose entire purpose, whose entire 3,000-year existence was to be a place of counting, we did not unroll the scroll on the 15th. Conservation protocol for textile-wrapped organic material in a desert climate requires a controlled humidity environment and ideally a temperature differential management process, and the scroll had waited long enough that it could wait a further 24 hours while we arranged adequate conditions using the camp's available resources. We moved it to the secure documentation box. We sealed the documentation box. We completed the day's work in the main chamber and came up the ladder at 6 p.m. and ate dinner. And I sat outside my tent in the specific darkness of an Egyptian plateau evening, a darkness that is not the absence of light, but a presence, a quality the desert has of attending to itself. And I watched the stars appear over the ridge, and I thought about the phrase on the linen, and I thought about the word on the wall, and I thought about the ration grade in the administrative records, and the administrative casualness with which those grades had been applied to hundreds of Semitic-named human beings who had been somewhere else before they were here, who had had something before the machinery of the state reduced them to a gang designation and a daily ration allocation and a proto-alphabetic name that the official record never bothered to officially use. It was at approximately 8:45 p.m., sitting on the camp stool outside my tent, that I heard the sound for the first time. I want to be precise about the conditions, because precision is the only tool I have left that I trust. The temperature was approximately 16 degrees Celsius, which is cold for someone accustomed to daytime desert heat and which had driven the rest of the team inside the common tent. There was no wind, the plateau in the evening is often entirely still, and that night was still in the way that felt deliberate. The way the silence after a sound is a different quality of silence from the silence before it. I was sitting approximately 15 meters from the shaft entrance, which was closed for the night with the wooden frame covering that serves as the standard field site overnight protection against animal entry and windborne sand. In that silence, from the direction of the shaft entrance, from some depth within it that I cannot estimate because stone modifies acoustics in ways I do not have the training to quantify, I heard a voice. Or rather, I heard a sound that organized itself, briefly and precisely, into the recognizable shape of a human voice, without producing any word I could identify in any language I know. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. It was not loud. It had the quality, the pitch, and the cadence, and the resonant frequency of a person speaking at a normal conversational volume in the room immediately adjacent to the room you are in, the sound of human speech with all of its specific acoustic characteristics intact, but without the semantic content. The way a voice arrives through a closed door, I found myself thinking through 32 centuries of fitted limestone. I did not move from my camp stool. The sound did not repeat. After 3 minutes, I went inside and I recorded it the following morning in my field journal, having decided overnight that I was confident enough in what I had heard to be willing to commit it to paper, which is the standard I apply to any observation I wish to treat as data rather than as personal experience. The scroll was unrolled on the 16th of March under the conditions we had been able to arrange. The documentation tent. Early morning before the temperature climbed, humidity managed by the field camp method of wetting the tent walls overnight and working in the coolest hours, padded conservation surface, raking lamplight, Prof. Okonkwo, the Supreme Council observer Hakim, one photographer, and myself. The papyrus was in extraordinary condition. The linen wrapping had protected it beyond what ambient desiccation alone would have achieved, and the surface, though darkened by oxidation to a near black that initially seemed to obscure the text, resolved under the raking lamp into something almost completely legible. And what was on it, what someone had written in the scratched Proto-Sinaitic alphabetic script that the Egyptian administrative apparatus had never officially recognized, without authorization, without official materials, using what I believed was a sharpened reed rather than a proper scribal stylus, was a list of names. Hundreds of names. Not the administrative names that appeared in the official records, not the Egyptian phonetic approximations assigned by the state machinery for its own bureaucratic convenience. These were different. These were the names these workers used among themselves, within whatever community existed inside the work compound, the names that encoded origin and family and self in the Northwest Semitic linguistic tradition. Names with roots I could identify, names built on the same roots that would appear centuries later in the personal name records of Canaanite cities, in the genealogical lists of early Israelite tradition, in the administrative archives of Ugarit and Byblos, and the cities of the Jordan Valley. And between the names, written in a faster, smaller hand, whether a second person or the same person, under different conditions of urgency or time, I cannot determine, were phrases. 2 and 3 words, 4 at most. Phrases that functioned not as administrative notation, but as what I can only call witnessing. She carried water for 6 years. He was taken in the 3rd year of the current count. This one came from the eastern settlements near the water. These two were father and daughter, separated at the second redistribution. This child was born inside the compound and has never known the fields outside it. I was reading aloud. It is a habit I have when working through a first translation. I read quietly, barely above a murmur, more for the cognitive processing that comes from hearing language rather than only seeing it than for any communicative purpose. I had been reading aloud for perhaps 20 minutes, working through the names and the brief phrases in the careful, unhurried way that first translation requires, when Prof. Okonkwo put her hand on my arm. I stopped reading. She was looking at the tent entrance, not at anything specific, At the entrance itself, the point where the canvas flap met the opening, where the early morning desert light came in as a thin, pale line. I looked at the entrance. The photographer looked at the entrance. Hakim, the Supreme Council observer, did not look at the entrance. He was looking at the ceiling of the tent with an expression that I recognized in the moment of seeing it. As recognition, not surprise, not fear in its acute form, but the expression of a person who had anticipated a possibility and was now seeing it realized and had already decided what to do about it. And in that moment of shared attention, in the particular dense silence of four people who have simultaneously stopped making any sound, from outside the tent entrance, from approximately 2 meters outside the tent entrance, in the open air of the desert plateau, in the early morning, came a voice. A human voice, speaking, in the frequency register, in the rhythmic cadence, and the specific acoustic quality of the voice I had been using 10 or 15 seconds before to read aloud from the scroll. I counted to 47. Not theatrically. The counting gave the rational part of my mind somewhere to be, while the rest of me did something that I do not have adequate clinical language for, but that felt, in the physical sense, like standing at the edge of a very large drop and understanding the drop for the first time. The voice outside the tent lasted for the full 47 seconds, and it did not produce any word in any language I recognized, and it did not precisely reproduce any specific phrase I had read, but its cadence, its rhythm, the way it organized itself into something that was shaped like language even when it did not constitute language. These were not coincidental to what I had been reading. They were a response to it. At 47 seconds, the sound stopped. Not faded. Cut. The way a recording ends. Hakim waited perhaps 15 seconds after the silence had fully settled, and then he looked at me, and he said quietly in English, his voice completely level, "Please close the scroll now." And then, a moment later, "Please ensure the limestone is replaced before sunset tomorrow, and nothing else." He did not explain. He did not look frightened. He looked like a person who had just seen a procedure he had hoped would not be necessary become necessary, and who was now proceeding to follow the procedure. I want to address the question of what the voice was, because I would not be honest if I did not address it. And honesty is the only obligation I have left in this account, since the obligations of professional discretion and institutional loyalty have both been adequately served in other documents. I am a scientist. I do not maintain the supernatural as a functional, explanatory category for physical phenomena. I accept fully that enclosed spaces with limited oxygen, extreme temperature differentials, the concentrated psychological weight of material of this specific historical and human density can produce auditory experiences that feel entirely real while having entirely ordinary neurological explanations. I have considered all of those explanations. I have returned to them many times in the years since March of 1997. None of them account for the simultaneity for people, the same sound, the same moment. None of them account for the acoustic relationship between what I had been reading and the structure of what was heard outside the tent. None of them account for what Hakim already knew, which I did not learn until the evening of the resealing, when he told me, quietly and without elaboration, that this chamber, or one very much like it, had been found before, in the first half of the 20th century, before the formal institutional frameworks that now govern Egyptian antiquities were in place, that the team from that earlier discovery had not resealed the shaft, that 3 members of that team had subsequently requested through unofficial channels to be removed from Egyptian fieldwork permanently, that those requests had been granted, that the documentation from that excavation was incomplete in ways that suggested it had been stopped in the middle rather than concluded. He did not tell me what had happened to the documentation. He did not tell me what had happened in the intervening time between that earlier opening and ours. He said only that the limestone was important and that before sunset was not a suggestion. We replaced the cap on the 17th at 4:45 p.m. The full team was present. We used structural adhesive to reapproximate the natron seal compound as closely as we could manage with the materials available to us. It was during the resealing, specifically during the 12 minutes it took for the adhesive to achieve initial set, during which time the team stood in silence around the shaft entrance, without speaking because Hakim had asked us not to speak, and none of us had questioned it, that the knocking came back. The same 3-beat pattern that 2 crew members had reported from inside the shaft walls earlier in the week. 3 beats, a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, 3 beats again. It came from directly beneath the limestone cap as we held it in position, from inside the sealed stone itself, rather than from the open chamber below, the way a sound travels through a medium rather than through air. The team heard it. I saw their faces. No one said anything. We held the cap steady until the adhesive set, and then we stood back and the knocking did not repeat. I do not know what it means that the sound came from inside the stone rather than from below it. I have thought about this for 6 years, and I still do not know. What I know is that it stopped when the seal was fully seated, and it has not, to my knowledge, been reported since. We photographed the inscription on the cap one final time before placement, and as I directed the final photograph, I read the inscription through once more, aloud and in full. And this time, the phrase that had registered to me in my first translation as standard protective legal formula, what had been accounted for within, was not to be named aloud in the world above. The limestone did not read to me as a formula. It read as an explanation. It read as the record of something that had been discovered and then, with considerable administrative care, managed. Someone in the Egyptian state apparatus, 3,000 years ago, had learned what happened when you named these things above the stone. Not as a curse. The inscription was not a curse. It was a record of cause and effect, written in the register of official legal language, because official legal language was the most durable form of communication available, and durability was the point. It was a warning addressed to whoever would eventually come, because whoever built this room knew that someone eventually would, and knew that the one thing the person who came would want to do, in the natural and irresistible human impulse that I had already demonstrated by sitting in a tent with a lamp and a magnifying glass, reading names aloud in a dead alphabetic script, was exactly the one thing that should not be done. Not because it was wrong, not because it was sacrilegious, because something heard its name and answered, and whatever the earlier team had experienced when the seal was not replaced was the consequence of an answer that was not closed back into the stone before it had fully arrived. The complete documentation, including all photographs, transcriptions, field notes, and a sealed copy of my preliminary scroll translation, was delivered to the Supreme Council of Antiquities on the 21st of March, 1997. The administrative records from the chamber, the official Egyptian hieratic documents, the gang rosters, the ration allocations. The tool distribution logs were published in a peer-reviewed archaeological journal in 1999. The scroll has not been formally published as of the date of this account. The official reason given is conservation status pending further analysis. I accept that reason in its official form. What I know, in the form that is not official, but is true, is that the scroll contains what it says it contains, the names, the real ones, the ones that the administrative machinery of one of history's most powerful civilizations processed, absorbed, renamed, regraded, allocated, and filed without ever officially recording, because the official record only needed the labor, not the identity, not the origin, not the name that encoded who a person was before they were a ration grade and a gang designation in the Western Works Division's administrative accounts. The scroll is the record that was made for the people the records were not made for. It was hidden in a room full of official records, which is both the most practical hiding place and, I have come to think, the most deliberate one. Everything around it was the machinery. The scroll was what the machinery could not contain. The history that sits in that room below the limestone deserves to be fully in the world. The institution it documents, bound foreign labor, systematically administered, legally codified, organized and filed and tracked, with the same bureaucratic care applied to the copper chisel inventory, was not a singular event. It was not one pharaoh and one people and one dramatic night of departure across a parted sea. It was a centuries-long structure, so normalized that its evidence is not hidden. It is filed, it is organized. It has proper shelving and a legal document on the door. The horror of it is not that it was concealed. The horror is that it was paperwork. What was concealed, what someone took considerable personal risk to conceal inside the already sealed room, was what the paperwork had chosen not to record. Not the bodies. The state needed the bodies. The names. The names that told you what body it was, where it had come from, who had been waiting for it somewhere in the eastern settlements near the water, who had been separated from it at the second redistribution, who had been born from it inside the compound and never known the fields. Those names were scratched into linen in a script no administrator would read, by a hand that understood the time was almost gone, and sealed inside a box, inside a room, under a limestone cap, with a legal prohibition on its surface that said, "Do not speak these," above the stone, because something would hear and something would answer. This account is the record of what answered. I am writing it in 2003, sitting at my desk in Bologna with the field journal open in front of me and the translated phrases from the scroll still in my handwriting on the page opposite. She carried water for 6 years. This child was born inside the compound and has never known the fields outside it. These are not mythology, they are not theology. They are field notes made by someone who was running out of time, in a script no one in authority could read, about people no official ledger was ever going to accurately hold. They were sealed in a room with the ledger that failed to hold them. I found them. I read them aloud, above the limestone, in a canvas tent in the Egyptian desert at 6 a.m. on the 16th of March, 1997. And what was below the stone heard its name and answered. And the limestone held, and I came home, and I am still thinking about it, and I expect I will be thinking about it for the rest of my professional life. That is the complete record. The seal is replaced. The limestone is back in position. Whatever waits below it was told that the limestone is the line, and it has honored that for 32 centuries, and it will honor it for 32 more, because it has nowhere else to be, and all the patience of those who were never permitted to be remembered above the ground. If you found this file in the archives, subscribe to ensure the next one is unsealed. The record is closed. The seal has been replaced. What was named above the limestone has returned below it. What remains with us is only what was always already here, the paperwork and the names the paperwork refused to hold. Survival rule. If you ever break the seal on a room built to hold what was not permitted to exist above the limestone, and if inside that room you find a list of names in a script that no official body ever authorized, do not read them aloud. Whatever rises toward the sound of its own name has been waiting longer than your civilization has been old. It will stop at the limestone. It always stops at the limestone. But hold the cap steady while the seal sets, and do not speak, and when you hear 3 beats from inside the stone itself, count them and do not answer. Those 47 seconds and those 3 knocks are yours entirely, and no field notes will adequately describe what it is to be on the receiving end of both.